Good morning, Highland. Glad that we can come together in this Bible class and continue in our study in the book of Genesis. And I am taking over for Chris Nicola uh, for the remainder of our time here that we'll be spending in this book from the Gospel Advocate quarterly. So I'm thankful for this opportunity and thankful for Chris for continuing to teach the class. Thankful for Javon for teaching the class last week, and looking forward to continuing to read through and study the book of Genesis with you all. We are looking in Genesis chapter 22, is where our lesson this morning is going to be coming from. Genesis 22, starting at verse number 1 and ending around verse number 19. So let's go ahead and read the passages together, and then we'll look at this account from the life of Abraham. Beginning of verse number 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. He said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So, where are we exactly in this account? Of course, we know the characters who are in this, and we've probably, if you've been raised in the church or been in the church long enough, you know about Abraham and Isaac in this pretty popular account that we read about in the book of Genesis. Where we are geographically is we are in Beersheba, or at least is where it starts. And you actually know that by going back to verse 32 in Genesis 21. So I'll use my arrow here. So Beersheba is right here. Now, um, God is going to give Abraham instruction. And this is not the first time Abraham has been given instruction. As we know, from the beginning of knowing who Abraham is when he was Abram, you know that God gave him instruction then and Abraham obeyed, right? Now, there is speculation that he partly obeyed because when God told him to basically leave your family and depart, leave your family and her and depart and go to the promised land, which he was going to show him, he ended up bringing his family with him, Lot being one of his nephew that he brought along. But God still gave him the land. God still showed him mercy and grace, even in him not following the command completely. But what we notice is Abraham is still battling with this aspect of faith. Even though we read in Hebrews 11, which we're going to go back to that passage in just a moment, with dealing with this specific account, we need to understand that even though Abraham is the father of faith, we still need to understand that Abraham is human and that he still struggles with his faith in God and trusting in God. That's really basically what this story of Abraham's life is about, is a constant battle of trusting in the one true God. And so he struggles with that, but it's interesting here in Genesis 22, he follows God without hesitation. And we'll explore that in just a moment again, especially looking at the other accounts, previous accounts, and his reaction to trusting in God. But here, Abraham's faith again is being tested. And it's being tested, and his faith throughout this has been tested by God. But here is really almost like the supreme test. The supreme test. And with this test came, with obedience to this test, came some great promises, right, that were given at the beginning of Abraham's journey. So these promises are sort of confirmed again in Genesis 22. So he's struggling here. But here we see a more mature Abraham, a more faithful Abraham than we have in previous chapters. So we'll discuss that in a moment. So what's going on here? What is God's instructions here in this passage? Well, it's quite simple. Abraham is supposed to take his only son, Isaac. Now, we know that Abraham and Sarah were not supposed to have Isaac, in the sense that they physically could not have children. They were up there in age, in their 90s, and it was basically physically impossible for them to have children at their age. Sort of similar how to some people in their age now just cannot bear children. But God promised Isaac to them. And so Isaac was a miracle child. Now, he wasn't from a virgin birth, but he would have been a type of miracle, in the same sense of Jesus, right? The coming of Jesus. So he's a type of Christ here, which there's a bunch of types here, or basically glimpses into the coming of the Messiah that is being brought here through the book of Genesis. And so we see another instance of this here in chapter 22. But he's supposed to take that promised son, that only begotten son, to the land of Moriah. And he's supposed to offer that only begotten son, his only son, he is supposed to offer as a burnt offering. Now, there has been great lengths have been made to have and bear this son. And this great promise that Abraham and Sarah were looking forward to, even placing, trying to put matters into their own hands that failed, God still blessed them with this only begotten son of both Abraham and Sarah. But yet God is now telling him to sacrifice Isaac. So just so you get a geographical idea of where this could possibly be. Now, some commentators believe that, and usually the mainstream view is that um, Abraham and Isaac journeyed to Mount Moriah, which would be in the Jerusalem area. But some commentators actually believe that it was not Mount Moriah that's in Jerusalem. It was actually somewhere out this way in the area of Hebron, so just shy of Jerusalem. So you see the city of Hebron here, but the region of Hebron is around here. So it could have been anywhere 3 days journey from Beersheba to the region of Hebron. So most likely it was somewhere in this area, some other mountain other than Mount Moriah that we would later be introduced in Israel's history. But regardless of where the location is, it was a 3 days journey to get to where Abraham and Isaac were going. And they weren't the only ones going towards this mountain. He took two individuals, two young men with him to help him with this load. So we'll get more into this story in a moment, but I just want to basically tackle some key questions here. And the reason I want to tackle these questions here is because, one, there is a teaching out there. If you're not aware of this, there's a teaching that is done by many critics of the Bible that basically say that God is the creator of both good and evil. And they go to passages like this to show that God was basically telling Abraham to do something that was illegal, that God would have condemned, which is the killing of innocents, right? But there's a few problems with that theory that I want to go ahead and address early on. There's a lot of problems with this. But the main issue with this question, and this is really the question, why would God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, period? Why would God ask Abraham to do this? Again, what this chapter is doing is giving us what the accounts here in the book of Genesis and what the gospel, the Old Testament, will do quite often is point to the coming of the Messiah. So if that is your understanding, right? If that is your understanding of Scripture, that this is pointing towards what God is ultimately going to do with his only begotten son, then you would understand why this is happening. We're getting a glimpse into what is coming. We're getting a glimpse into what God is going to ultimately do. And not only, he's going to actually follow through. You see, one of the grandest points to why this theory of God created evil and using this passage to support that, the biggest debunk to that theory is the fact that Abraham didn't kill Isaac. Abraham didn't do it. He was ready to do it because God commanded him to do so, but he didn't do it. So I think it's interesting that people will go to this passage and say, look, here's God telling Abraham to do something evil, but Abraham didn't kill Isaac. God stopped him before he did it. I mean, yes, Isaac was good as dead, but he didn't kill him. He didn't follow through because God stopped him. So did God really want Isaac dead? I believe the answer to that is no, because if that were the case, if he really wanted Isaac dead, then don't you think that God would have allowed Abraham to do so? He would have. So no, God is not the creator of both good and evil. He is the only good. In matter of fact, he didn't create good, he is good. He is the embodiment of good. Evil is the opposite of God's goodness. And that's clear in scripture. So if anybody ever goes to this passage and tells you, well, here's a passage where God told Abraham to do something evil. Well, the fact that Abraham did not actually kill Isaac should tell you something. But again, we are looking at a type here of what is to come. So the very nature of this begotten son being sacrificed in order for purification, which is the whole point of animal sacrifices in the first place. But by the way, we know from the book of Hebrews that animal sacrifices, all that did for the Israelites was roll sin over. So they had to continually do this. But once we see Jesus come on the scene, he is the once and for all sacrifices for sins. So there is an atonement here aspect to this, that we are seeing a type of atonement or a type that is going to come. Again, this is a foreshadowing of what is going to come. An only begotten son being sacrificed for the good of man. That's ultimately what's being demonstrated here, even though it doesn't come to fruition fully until the Son of Man or Jesus comes to earth. But I want to address that at the beginning. And we'll go into it again because that's the whole key idea of this story or this account, is the foreshadowing of what is to come, Jesus the Christ. But why didn't Abraham question God this time? So I told you earlier that if you look at the chapters before of Abraham's problems of trusting in God, Abraham constantly questioned God in so many ways. As early as when we're actually introduced to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 as Abram, he had a huge problem trusting in God. Sure, he had moments of conquering his faith in God, but there were some really doozy moments. And so you recall when God told him and Sarah that they were going to have Isaac in the first place. Some time went by. No baby. No pregnancy. So what do? Sarah basically tells Abraham to sleep with his handmaiden Hagar. But their handmaiden Hagar. And they have, of course, Ishmael, but Ishmael's not the promise. And they had to be reminded of that. And so there was a moment where they did not trust in God, that this promise is going to happen. And then when Lot and his family are in Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham questions God again, as if God won't save Lot and his family or any other righteous person in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abraham had a lot of moments where he questioned God. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have moments too. When tragedy strikes, when things aren't going the way that we want them to go, we question God. And I wouldn't say that it's okay to question God, but if you're gonna question God, you better be ready for God's answers. And God answered Abraham on every occasion. And I would suggest to you that he answers us on every occasion as well. He may not answer the way that we want him to answer, but God does answer the plea of his children. He is the Father of all. So why didn't Abraham question God this time? Well, I believe that his faith had matured up to this point. Every promise that God has delivered or given to Abraham has happened. He gave him Isaac. He saved Lot and his family. Every promise thus far has been accomplished. So I think Abraham here is a very more mature Abraham. So when God tells him to do this, he does it without any hesitation. We're going back to the Abraham that we were originally introduced to. An Abraham that just said, I'm going. And this time he fully commits. He fully commits. So I want you to think about this. The work that would have, or the drive that would have had to be in Abraham, or the faith that had to be in Abraham for him to do this. So just two questions really to think about, and we'll get into the details of the passages here. But one question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is going through the mind of Abraham? Now we know that he doesn't have any he does this without any hesitation. But you got to think, Abraham's human, and he is the father of two sons, but this is the special son, the only begotten, the one in which the promises were going to come of this nation that's going to be built from Abraham's seed. So you have to think how special he must think of Isaac, and the bond that Isaac and Sarah must have in this relationship with their son Isaac. What's interesting is we're not told anything about Sarah and what must be going through her mind. We're not told if Abraham told Sarah that this was going to happen. Now, we know that Sarah was kind of strong-willed. We know that because Sarah was the one that suggested to Abraham in the first place to sleep with his handmaiden, with their handmaiden. So I'm not saying that just bear with me here. This is not a sexist remark or anything. It's just a complete observation of Sarah and her interaction with her husband. Now, there were times where Abraham basically, put his foot in his own mouth. When Sarah and him went to Egypt, and Abraham told Sarah, don't tell anybody that you're my wife, tell them you're my sister, so I don't get killed, right? So there's some blame to be put on both ends. But I think it's just interesting that Sarah is not mentioned here, that Abraham telling Sarah that this is what's going to happen. And I don't know why it is. I mean, there's speculation. Maybe it's because Abraham didn't want to worry Sarah, or it would have been too much for Sarah. Or maybe she does know, and maybe she's begging Abraham not to do this. We don't know, is the point. But I think it is interesting that we're not told if Abraham told Sarah that I'm about to go sacrifice our only son. We're not told that. But as a father myself, and maybe you're a father or you're a mother or a parent, a grandparent, but imagine the devastation if God were to tell you to sacrifice your only son, or any son for that matter, or daughter of yours, that you got to do this. I think all of us would struggle. I think all of us would have maybe not a hesitate. Well, I know for a fact I probably have a hesitation to do so. But even if I went through with it, in my mind, I would be grieving. So you have to think, I mean, this has to be a grieving father. To be put through this, he has to be grieving. He has to have some type of mental, emotional toll on him to do this. And so we see here in verse number 3 that he gets up early in the morning to start the process of getting prepared to take off that same day and take Isaac to sacrifice him. He gets up very early. He saddles up his donkey. He gets two young men with him and his son Isaac. And then they go and cut wood for the burnt offering. Now, if you know again about this geographical area, you know that early on there was a huge famine in the area. And it doesn't seem, at least from historians, it doesn't seem as if that trees would have been plentiful. So this probably was a very difficult task, and would probably require him and others to rise up early that morning. But I think also, I mean, it could be possible too that Abraham rose early that morning, not only for that reason, but because, I mean, he wants to probably spend as much time with Isaac as he possibly can. I'm just thinking from a fatherly standpoint of my, attachment to my own children, to have to witness their death. I mean, I don't know how much of a daunting. I mean, there is nothing more. And we just, in our congregation, one of our members had just experienced this, losing a child, and there are others in our congregation that have lost children. I mean, I haven't lost a child, and I don't know what that feels like. So I can't even begin to imagine what that must feel like. But I would imagine that it's devastating. So I mean, so thinking about it from that standpoint, for Abraham and the devastation that he must be feeling, even though he's carrying this out, even though he's completely doing it, and he's not hesitant, there has to be some type of emotional toll that is being taken on Abraham. I say that to say this, that oftentimes when we look at characters in the Bible, and we look at these characters basically acting on faith, which faith comes from a belief in the one true God and their obedience to him, and knowing that God is a faithful father and God is an obedient, and Jesus demonstrates obedience even as the Son of God. These characteristics are of God, but our emotions are also of God. The very emotions that we have are the same emotions that God has. God can be angry, God can be happy, God can be joyous, God can be sad. So when I think about God giving up his only begotten Son, the emotional toll that God would have to experience, I think we don't think about, because we think, oh, God is the embodiment of good and righteousness and justice, so therefore he's just gonna do it, and he's not gonna have the emotional toll that we would as humans, being obedient even until the point of death. No. Even though God would have had joy because of what Jesus did, he's gonna also have an emotional toll of sadness because that's his only begotten Son. So I think sometimes we don't think about that. That a lot of the emotions that we experience, God also has and experiences. And we read about it in Scripture where God is angry or saddened. So there's an emotional toll that even God puts upon himself for our good. I really want you to think about that. The emotional toll that God puts on himself for our good by giving up his only begotten Son. So Abraham has to have some type of emotional toll, and he's doing this, and without hesitation, he's getting up early in the morning, he's taking his son Lot, he's doing the physical burden of making sure that all the utensils and things that are needed to actually do this sacrifice are done, and they go off. And in verse 4, the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar. And then he tells the two servants that he and the boy are going to go and worship. Now, just so we're clear, again, what's going through the mind of Abraham, we're already told something that Hebrews 11 tells us, but we're told it here in this passage, just based on the words that he says. He says to the two young men that accompany him and Isaac, he says, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there, talking about to the mountains in this land of Moriah, and worship, and come again to you. Now that's interesting, because in Hebrews 11, we're told of something about Abraham's attitude towards sacrificing Isaac. But yet, we're told of this not just in Hebrews 11, but in the passage itself in Genesis 22. He says that we'll come again. That once we're done worshiping, we're going to come back and everything's going to be good. So we're already given a glimpse into Abraham's mindset. He believes that somehow, some way, even if he sacrifices Isaac, that God's going to bring him back. He believes in a resurrection, and that's huge. There are a lot of people that would say that the concept of a resurrection is only unique to Christianity. No, it's not. It's a concept that God's people understood from the beginning. Abraham understands the concept of resurrection. And here he believes, and that's what Hebrews 11 shows us, he believes that even when he sacrifices Isaac, that a resurrection is going to happen, that God will resurrect Isaac from the dead. He believes this, which is going again to an understanding of how big the promise of Isaac here is. And we'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to point that out. So what is going through the mind of Abraham? Even though he may be extremely devastated by this news, even though there may be a huge emotional toll in obeying this command of God, Abraham still has hope. Abraham still has his trust in God, even though he's about to do this. So we see Abraham still full of faith and hope, despite the devastation and the emotional toll that is being placed upon him in this test. And he's going through that. The second question I wanted us to think about is, when Isaac finds out that he's the sacrifice, what is he thinking? So they go up to the mountains. They're preparing everything, and Isaac is definitely following suit. And so Isaac notices and tells his father, hey, I see everything is here ready to go, but where's the sacrifice? And what's interesting is here, the response that Abraham gives. Here it's recorded, God in verse number 8, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. For an offering, my son. If you were to sort of reconstruct this sentence in Hebrew, or look at it from what it could be also possibly translated, it could be translated to the effect of, God has provided the sacrifice, which is you. And I'm not no Hebrew scholar, but this is from other commentators that I got this understanding. So it's quite possible that could be the translation, which would make sense since Isaac, I think at this point, would have understood that he is a sacrifice. I don't think it was just Abraham just told him, one is going to be provided. And then, Isaac is like, I wonder what that is. I think in the statement, it's implied that Isaac would have understood and Abraham would have directly told him, it's you. It's you. So, now Abraham basically places Isaac, binds him up, and places him down. Now, here's the interesting thing. Hebrew tradition records Isaac as Isaac's age or possible age. Josephus, who was a famous historian was a famous Jewish historian during the time of Rome. Josephus is a very accurate historian, one accredited historian, who talks also about the Messiah. He's a great source of demonstrating the Messiah did exist. Jesus did exist. He was a real person, and he actually did, die on the cross. I mean, of course, Josephus wouldn't believe in the resurrection, but he did believe that Jesus was an actual historical figure. But he records that the tradition of Isaac being about 25 or so years old. Other traditions put him around in his 30s. So Isaac isn't. I think what is pictured in Western thinking is that Isaac is like a teenager. Most likely, he's a young man, somewhere in his 20s or 30s. So some time has gone by before this event actually takes place. So now I think what it would be easier for us to picture is a grown man tackling a teenager or a preteen and binding him up, right? Against Isaac's will. But that's not what we're seeing here. And most likely, again, he's a young man. So would Abraham have to tackle Isaac to bind him up and actually put him on the altar? I don't think so. I think Isaac is following suit. I think Isaac has made peace with this somehow. Now, again, we're not told, but I don't think that Abraham had a fight with him. The fact that the words that are used here, laid the wood down, bound him up, laid him on the altar. I don't think this is a young man fighting with an older man, and I don't think Isaac is running away from this. And the fact that Abraham tells Isaac, "You are the God-given sacrifice," I think, and again, this is just speculation, but I think this goes to the teaching and the parenting of Isaac that Abraham does of Isaac. I think Isaac is very used to the idea of sacrificial sacrifices made to God. And maybe there's a sense that Isaac feels honored to be the sacrifice. I don't know. I'm pretty sure this would have put another emotional toll on him as well. So I'm sure this is not easy for Isaac to do, but I don't see an Isaac that is fighting with Abraham to be bound up and be the sacrifice. Don't see it. Now, it could be possible, but I don't see it here. So it seems like Isaac is complying, and he's doing this. But again, what must be going through his mind? I'm sure there's an emotional toll here as well for Isaac. So basically the point is here that Isaac was good as dead. Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son, even though it was his only son, his only begotten son, the special son, the son that the promises would come through. And Isaac followed suit. He complied to be ready to be sacrificed. But as the passage goes on, we know that God stops him by an angel. And notice what the angel tells him. The angel tells him, "Do not lay your hand on the boy." This is verse 12. "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God." So God, again, this is a test that God has given him. There has been many tests that God has given him of Abraham's faith. And many times Abraham questioned God. But at this point, he's not questioning. He's following suit. And Isaac was good as dead. But God stops him and tells him through this angel, we know now, I know now that you fear me. I know now that you truly have your faith and trust in me. You don't have to finish this because you passed the test. See, there's a difference between God's test and Satan's test. Satan's test would have already had Abraham kill his entire family, okay? Because it's not supposed to bring out the best in people. It's supposed to bring out the worst. Satan's test is always about selfishness. God's test brings about the best in man. And these two quotes actually come from a book I've mentioned this book before in other studies that I've done in the Pentateuch, but the book is called the Pentateuch, and it's written by James E. Smith, probably one of my favorite books on a survey of the Pentateuch, and he gives some great points in this book on this chapter specifically, and other chapters as well. But he quotes that Satan, and I put stand for some reason. I'm sorry. Satan tempts men to bring out the worst in them. God tests to help bring out the best. The most severe tests come from the Lord, yet the greatest blessings accompany them. The greatest blessings accompany them. So what is the blessings that we see here in this account? Well, look back at Hebrews chapter 11. When the Hebrew writer talks about this very account in the faith of Abraham, notice what he says. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So Abraham already saw the future blessings, even in sacrificing his only begotten son. He truly believed that God would bless him by raising Isaac back up from the dead. You gave him up to me, I will give him back to you. He considered this. But again, Abraham already believes in the resurrection. He already believes in this to the point that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. But the point is, he didn't have to. He didn't have to. So, the key passage and what we're going to conclude with is really verse number 18. But let's go back to verse number 15. Okay? Verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time. So the initial time, he told him, God is gonna provide you. You have fear in God. You have passed the test. You don't have to kill your son. And God provided him a ram in the bush or a thicket, right? And they offered it to God and worshiped him, right? And called the place, in verse 14, the Lord will provide. Yahweh will provide. But notice in verse 15, so the angel comes back to him a second time, and he says this, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. So this is the message of the Lord, from the Lord. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. So because you were willing to do this, I'm going to bless you. So he's reaffirming the promises that were given to Abraham at the beginning that were introduced to him in Genesis 12. So I will bless you because you've done this. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sands that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. So your offsprings are going to be victorious. And no enemy is going to take them completely out. Right? I will bless those who bless you. I will curse them and curse you. Right? Verse 18 is the key passage here. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. What is this pointing to? This is pointing to the Messiah. Through the seed promised through Isaac, the Messiah is coming. And because of the Messiah coming to redeem the world, all nations of the earth will be blessed. This entire account points to Jesus. That God is going to actually sacrifice his only begotten son, that he is going to go through with it. And he's going to use his enemies to accomplish it. And Jesus is then going to be resurrected by God. The resurrection is real. And because of this, the promise of a resurrection for us is coming. We don't have to fear death. We can overcome it. Abraham didn't fear the death of his son because he truly believed the resurrection was real. And we too don't have to fear the death of our own selves or anyone else or in Jesus, because we know that God will one day resurrect us, just like he resurrected his only begotten son, Jesus the Christ, the King of all nations. So that's ultimately what this story is about, is connecting us or giving us a foreshadowing of the one who would bless all nations. Abraham's offspring, Jesus the Christ, will bless every single nation under heaven with the chance of the true resurrection and being with God for eternity. That's the story of Genesis 22. That's the story of Abraham and Isaac. What a beautiful account this really is. So hopefully that helped you in some way. Hopefully you can see how we are blessed even today by this account and by the fact that God spared the life of Isaac, bringing the promise of the Messiah to come and resurrecting him. So that way we can have a resurrection newness of life. So hopefully that helped you in some way. And hopefully you're starting to see this story of redemption throughout the book of Genesis. So may God bless you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us. We hope and pray that our messages are encouraging and are uplifting and are helpful in your walk with God. To get more information and more content for your journey with God, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also join us on Facebook and like our page there, and you'll get all of our messages, our Bible classes, and any other messages that might come down our pipe as we continue to create and try to share God's Word. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.